Welcome, everyone. Happy Monday for those of you who are joining us live. If you don't know me by now, I'm Avery Bradford. I'm head of programming and events for Female Founder Collective and the 10th House. We just welcomed our new fall cohort, and I think this is our first official workshop since the fall cohort joined us. So welcome if you are members of the fall cohort. It's great to see you here. By the way, if you're joining us live, let us know where you are tuning in from. I am coming in from Denver, Colorado. Rebecca is coming from Seattle. We typically have New York or LA in the house, but would love to see where you're joining us from. Today, we are going to be talking about DIYing your HR strategy. So everything from the policies behind your hires, whether it's time to hire, how to know the strategies behind that hire process, freelancers versus contractors versus full-time, all those things that as founders we need to know is what we're going to be covering today. Okay, we have Austin, Texas joining us. Let me put in my locale. Denver, Austin, I wonder if were you at Female Founders Day earlier this year? I wonder if we met, Amy. If not, I don't want to waste any more time. I know some of you will be trickling in, but a reminder, this event is recorded and sent out as a replay. So if you missed the first couple of minutes, no problem. Oh, Amy, you were there. Okay, so we probably did meet. I will be sending that out Sunday and early next week. So you'll get a couple touch points to watch this replay. We have a couple of events coming up soon. One of the top things that founders were looking for who joined this fall cohort was venture capital. So we have a venture capital conversation coming up here really soon. And also hiring was a big question that we got not only inside of the community, but inside of that orientation that we had last week. So this couldn't have been more perfect timing. Speaking of timing, Rebecca, I'm not going to take up any more time. I'm going to pass it over to you to get started.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. We are going to get started. Hopefully everybody, Avery, are we good on?
All good here.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you everybody for having me. I am really excited to be here. So first I'll tell you a little bit about myself. By way of introduction, my name is Rebecca Weaver. I am an HR professional by trade. I have about 20 years, well, 20 plus now, years of experience in HR. The early part of my career was with Fortune 50 companies like Target and Home Depot. Spent my time kind of working my way up the corporate ladder, and then got pretty close to the top and discovered like, oh, this is all there is, and it was definitely not for me. So I left corporate America and went to work for a really experimental company. It was called Downtown Project at the time. It's now called DTP Companies, but it was a private organization created by the late Tony Hsieh to revitalize downtown Las Vegas. It was a fascinating experience, absolutely wild and crazy, and could be a whole webinar all on its own, but that's not why we're here today. But even though it was a wild and crazy experience, so for example, we had about 300 employees with no people managers. I learned a ton from that experience and from my corporate experience. And in the wake of Me Too, I launched HRuprise because, you know, for my profession, I had been looking at all the ways in which HR was really, quite frankly, part of the problem. And it really set me on this path of really breaking down and rediscovering the role of HR, blowing it up entirely, and how can we create HR that actually works for employees. So that's what leads us to where we are today. I will start by saying what we do at HRuprise is we support small businesses and startups, growing organizations, nonprofits, and for-profits with owners just like you. And we really help you navigate the world of human resources, the world of building company culture. So here's what I hear most often, since we're focusing on solopreneurs especially. I would say I'll use the term solopreneur pretty frequently, but I'm also talking about organizations that if it's just you and a co-founder, for example, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today will also apply there. So, solopreneurs, you are potentially just getting started, or you're building a solopreneur business. Maybe you intend for it just to be you. You are possibly using some part time contractors to help you do all the things. And there are so many things to get done, right? You might be thinking about your future company culture, and you are being scrappy as all get out. That's my um, politically my um safe for work version of that, but you were being scrappy as all get out, trying to get everything done. These are some of the questions that you're asking, and I know this because these are the questions that I get from solopreneurs all the time. So first question, how do I know when to hire my first employee? How do I know the difference between a 1099 and W-2? And if you're not even familiar with what those two numbers or letters distinctions mean, we're going to get into it. So don't worry about that. What structures do I actually need to have in place? And do I really have a company culture if it's just me? So spoiler alert, the answer to that is absolutely yes. And we'll talk about that as we go. But more than anything, this is the question that I get. How do I manage when I don't know what I don't know? And this is usually in the context of talking about all of the things when it comes to compliance and making sure I'm staying on the right side of legal issues, building companies, building a team, all of these things. What if I don't even know what I don't know? So I'm here to help with that. And what I want to say, let's start with this. We, at my company, we talk about building radically human workplaces. And so let's talk about the definition of that. A radically human workplace is one where every single employee has the support, the structure, and the safety that they need to do their best work. And when I talk about safety, I'm talking about both physical safety and I'm talking about psychological safety. Right. So, again, even if it's just you and a founder, you too also deserve to have the support structure and safety you need to do your best work. So, that is really what we are trying to create and what we help companies with. So there's so much that happens. I want to give you the framework. When you're looking at how do I do it myself, here's a framework. And if you have something paper in front of you, you can draw this. I'm going to be sharing a ton of information. So you can email me. I'll share my email address at the end, and I can email you these slides as well. So don't worry too much about having to take notes. But here's a really helpful framework as you think about how to put all of these things together. And as you see, the radically human workplace is in the center of this. Okay, so first circle is about supporting your team, right? And again, if it's just the two of you, if it's just you're a solopreneur, you will also still have a team. Maybe you are, again, employing some contractors. Maybe you're engaging with vendors. You do have a team, even if you're a solopreneur. Covering your bases. This is really about making sure that you are staying compliant. There are tons of obligations for you as an employer. And so all of the compliance and things that are, really have to do with covering your bases are included in that next circle. And then the last one is really about building your culture. And as I mentioned before, even if you're a solopreneur, you absolutely have a company culture. You have clients, you have customers, you may have vendors, you may have business partners or partnerships that you work with, you engage with other companies. All of those things really come to your culture. So even if you don't have employees by definition of employee, you still have a company culture. And so again, we'll talk about all of this. So keeping that in mind, let's start with supporting your team. All right, so one of the biggest questions that I get from solopreneurs when it comes to this is deciding to hire. How do I even know if I need to decide if I need to hire somebody? So let's talk about some of the indications that you might have that it's time to hire. First, you're turning down work because you cannot handle it all. You might have identified new potential revenue streams that are going to require some additional support. The quality of your products or services might be suffering. And so this might be another indication. If you feel like you can't deliver the same quality that you really want to deliver to your clients, that might be something to consider as well. You don't have time to keep up with all the administrative stuff, right? So whether it's financials, bookkeeping, paperwork, all of the stuff that goes along with running businesses, if you don't have time with that, it might be a time to consider to hire. And then if you need somebody with a specific skill set, that's also a time to think about it. If you can't take a break or a vacation, I mean, we understand, right? If we're running a business, there are times where it may require you to be on, but you also need to be able to take breaks. You also need to be able to take some time away to keep yourself refreshed. And so it's really, really important. If you just absolutely feel like you can't, it might be time to think about bringing some folks on board to help you manage the work. If your company isn't growing, this might also be a time, again, to think about it. And if you need more than one freelancer, again, this is not a hard and fast rule, but if you're thinking about hiring, multiple freelancers, this might be an indication it's time to hire. And this sounds really obvious, but is there enough work to keep a new hire busy? So, and if you plan to sell your business, it might also be a time to think about hiring. So, when not to hire, this is almost as important, if not more important, than thinking about when to hire. But here's some things to think about when you should not be hiring. Number one, if you're uncertain about cash flow, if you don't know that you can support salaries for an employee or multiple employees, then you should not think about hiring. Again, it's important to make decisions for the long term in addition to the short term. So if you're uncertain about where your cash flow is, that's something you should really put the brakes on and think long and hard about whether hiring makes sense. If you don't know what the employee will be doing. So I hear this from solopreneurs really frequently. They'll say like, oh, we just need people who could come on and kind of do a little bit of everything. And yes, I think especially with small organizations or growing organizations, there's definitely an element that you need people to be a self-starter. You need them to be able to hit the ground running and kind of figure out what they need to do. But if you don't have a really clear idea about what that person's responsibilities will be, about what the scope of their role, what they'll be responsible for, I would say, again, pump the brakes and spend some time really thinking about that before hiring somebody on board. And if you're not willing to do what it takes to get your employees, set them up for success, you should not be hiring. It takes an investment in time, energy, resources, and in a lot of cases, things actually slow down and it feels like it takes more time in the beginning. But again, think of it as an investment in time. So you really do have to think about being willing to do what it takes to set your employees up for success. All right, I'm going to pause there just for a moment and see if we have any questions on what we've talked about so far. All right, so let's talk then about some strategies for hiring. And I will be happy to go back and answer questions if they do pop up. So let's talk about some strategies for hiring. This is really crucially important. There's a question that people ask me frequently about hiring, and they'll say like, oh, we just want to hire like rock stars, and I'll just go and hire people I've worked with before who I know how they work, and et cetera, et cetera. What I want to lay out for you right now is our strategies for hiring, making sure that you are centering diversity, that you are doing everything you can to build a diverse and equitable team. And it's actually much easier than most people think. So I want to talk through. I should say it's simpler than most people think. It's not always easy, but it is definitely the most important thing that you can do to build a strong and diverse team. So Here are the strategies I have, and then I'm going to go into each one of these individually. So the first one is hiring potential over pedigree. And we'll talk about what that means. The second strategy is focusing on a culture add versus a culture fit. And then the last one is hiring for a thought process rather than hypotheticals. So let's dig in and I'll tell you what I mean by each of these things. So, strategy number one, hiring for potential, not pedigree. What I hear from people, and I hear this in startups especially, oh, we are only hiring rock stars or ninjas, or pick any one of those terms that startups love to use. There are a couple of reasons I don't like that kind of terminology. Number one, there's a ton of research now that supports that if you use terms like rock star, ninja, some of those types of like kind of non-traditional terms, they actually are far more attractive to men or male identifying individuals than they are to women or female identifying. So that's like right off the bat, that's the first reason I don't love it. The second reason is that it tends to put people in a mindset of only hiring for pedigree, only hiring for people who have worked for well-known organizations. So, oh my goodness, they are, we only want to hire people who have worked for Facebook or Google, for example. Or maybe they're coming with pedigree in their educational background. So you see a Harvard MBA or Stanford MBA. And by definition, those are going to be less diverse because historically, those folks who have had those kinds of jobs, and again, we've got all kinds of research that will support all of this, are typically white and male by and large, and sometimes white and female. So that's why I don't want us to focus only on that. Of course, you're looking for the absolute best candidate that you can find for the job. So when we're looking at potential, the best way to do that, I have found in all my years, and I have probably interviewed literally thousands of people over the course of my career, everything from warehouse worker jobs to vice presidents at those Fortune 50 companies that I mentioned earlier. I have done, and everything in between. These are the competencies that I'm looking for when I'm looking for potential. What kind of potential does this person have? First and foremost, a collaborative mindset. Are they interested in working with teams? Can they tell you how they have worked through things, how they have worked with other people to get things done? That's a collaborative mindset. Second is somebody who's accountable, somebody who can tell you, oh yeah, I really screwed this thing up, but here's what I learned from it, or yeah, I took accountability for that decision. I realized later it was the wrong thing to do. And again, here's what I learned from that experience. You really want people who are truly accountable. And next, let's talk about communication skills. Um, can people communicate? Can they convey to you what it is that you need to know? Can they tell a story well? Can they inspire other people if they're going to be in a role where they're managing people? Um, so communication skills and the ability to communicate their ideas is very important. A service-based approach to leadership. So again, is it someone who approaches leadership roles with an idea that their role is there to serve their team rather than their team is there to serve them as the leader? And then again, you want to have somebody who sees problems and comes up with good solutions. So you want somebody who will say, hey, I see that thing over there. I think it's not working quite right. And I have an idea about how to fix it. Those are the kinds of things that give you a great insight into someone's potential. And then the last part is, are they courageous? Are they willing to stand up for things that they believe in? Are they willing to stand alone sometimes and be the lone voice for what they believe is right? So those are all the things that I look for when I'm looking for potential. So I'm going to share a couple of my favorite interview questions with you. So feel free to use these. First, tell me about a time you had to convince a coworker to do something in a new way. So you'll see I'm pulling in some of that communication. I'm pulling in that collaborative mindset. I'm listening for exactly how did they do that? Did they run into resistance? How did they work around that? So this is one of my favorite interview questions. You really get to learn a lot about a person's thought process um, when you ask questions like this. All right, strategy number 2, look for culture adds rather than culture fits. So what we hear from people, and this has been conventional wisdom for a really long time, is, oh, we're looking for people who will be a fit into our culture. We're really proud of our culture. We want people who will fit in. This is one of the most simple and yet most profound changes you can make in your hiring process, is to flip that around to say, not who will fit into our culture, but what will this person add to our culture? What will they bring that we don't already have represented? What does this person bring a lived experience that we don't have represented? Do they have professional experience that we don't have represented? Do they have, it's all of these things. What is this person going to add to our culture rather than will they fit in? And the reason for this is that we are hardwired to be drawn to people who are like us. So, very famously, well, at least in HR circles, it was somewhat famous. Microsoft, many years ago, actually got in trouble and with, I believe it was the EEOC, because they had this, fairly elaborate interviewing process. But ultimately, the question was, would you want to get stuck on a desert island with this person? Or there are variations of it. It's, would you want to go on a 3-hour car ride with this candidate? Right. And ultimately, if you're using that kind of measurement, and I will say, in my past, that is literally what I was trained to do, was ask myself that question. Oh, would I want to go on a 3-hour car ride with this person? But the problem with that is that, again, we are hardwired to be drawn to people who are like us. So the more that we are looking for that, oh, do I like this person? Rather than, is this person the right fit for the job? Is this person going to bring something that I don't already have represented at my team? We're going to, if you have that culture fit mindset, you will naturally build teams that are less diverse. Here's another one of my favorite interview questions. Tell me about a time you had a difference of opinion with somebody higher up than you. And what did you do? Again, you will find out a ton of information. Is this person thinking about that kind of thing? If they say, like, oh no, I've never done that. Or if they say, oh yes, I do it all the time, and I, stamp my feet, and that's all that I do, right? So there's a huge variety in the responses that you will get to this kind of question, but really what you're listening for is that thought process. How did they identify? How did they decide that it was something that was worth bringing up? How did they go about bringing solutions, right? So again, that's another favorite interview question. Feel free to steal it. But above all, what I want you to think about is actively seeking out the candidates who make you a little uncomfortable, right? They go, oh, I'm not really sure. This person might blow up everything that we're doing, but maybe that is a good thing. Maybe that is something that your team needs because they're bringing a perspective that you don't currently have. So ultimately, think about actively seeking out those candidates who make you go kind of, oh, I don't know, right? As opposed to what I hear from solopreneurs all the time is like, oh, I'm going to hire somebody who's just like me. I need to hire another mini me. These are all phrases that I've heard over and over again, right? So we're going to put a stop to that because we're looking for culture add, not culture fit. All right, you've heard me say this a couple times already, but the strategy number 3 in hiring is about assessing the candidate's thought process. So I love situational based questions. As you've seen, like a couple of those questions I've shared with you already are the tell me about a time when. And the reason for that is that I'm looking for the person's thought process. So the context doesn't really even matter nearly as much as I want to know, how did they work through issues? How are they solving problems? How are they thinking about things? How are they moving through? And so again, it doesn't really matter if it was at this job versus that job, if it was recent or not. I'm really looking for, again, what was their thought process and what did they learn from that experience? And so that's where I love these kinds of questions. as opposed to a question that would be, tell me how you would handle a problem performer on your team. That's a hypothetical. And again, what you'll get is somebody who probably knows what the correct answer to that question is. But what you really want is let's dig into their thought process. So that's why I really like situational based questions. Again, the tell me about a time when you did this, because the best predictor, here's the key. The best predictor of how they're going to act in the future is what they've already done, right? And so again, even if the context is going to be different at my company, if they can show me how they had a really similar thought process to what I'm looking for, that's ultimately what I want in a candidate. There's one more favorite interview question. Tell me about a time, and this is a really good one for if you're hiring somebody into a leadership role or a management role. Tell me about a time when you identified someone with problem performance. What did you do? So how did they identify it? How did they work through it with that employee? How much ownership did that leader take on for the employee's problem performance? So again, you're listening for that accountability. You're listening for all of those things, courage. Sometimes even if it's somebody who reports to you, it can be a really courageous conversation to talk to somebody about their problem performance. So that's another one of my favorite interview questions. And here's what I will say. Interviews shouldn't be a gotcha. So there are some large companies that are still, and I think they're still doing this, that have a practice that will ask questions like, how many ping pong balls can fit in a school bus? Or questions like that really are meant to, number one, show off how smart the interviewer is, right? Rather than it being a good experience for the candidate. And it doesn't tell you anything. So don't set up your interviews. In fact, I strongly recommend sending out the interview questions ahead of time. Give people some opportunity to review the questions. Some people really need more time to reflect and think about things to give you a truly thoughtful answer to your questions. So it should be an open book test. So interviews shouldn't be a gotcha. And I think, again, by thinking about implementing some of those kinds of practices, sending them out ahead of time, allowing people some extra time to respond, again, it's not meant to be catching somebody off guard. That really doesn't give you much information. And all it does is make the interviewer feel smart. All right, I'll pause there and see if anybody has questions on hiring. I'm throwing a ton of information at you, I know. All right. All right. Avery will let me know if we have other questions.
Yes,
all right.
I'll pause in if I see any.
Thank you. All right. So covering your bases. This is the next part. This is the part that, it's maybe not the sexiest part of HR, quite frankly. But this is the part that's going to keep you out of legal trouble. So it is one of the most important and one of the things that I get tons of questions about. So let's talk about how you cover your bases as a solopreneur. So first and foremost, this is the biggest one when it comes to being a solopreneur, understanding employee basics. So understanding, what's an employee versus a contractor, how do you classify employees? And again, I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version of all of this. But here are some employee basics. Here are some of the things that you need to know. First, let's talk about exempt versus non-exempt. Okay, so this is all governed by, and a lot of what I'm talking about right now in this compliance section is governed by the Fair Labor Standards Act. FLSA is the acronym. You can, I would write that down. I would search for it. It governs a lot of things about minimum wage, about who's eligible for overtime, all these things. So first, let's look at exempt. And you probably have heard these terms, exempt versus non-exempt. Think of it this way, because it does feel a little bit backwards to people sometimes, the titles. Exempt means you are exempt from eligibility for overtime pay. Ultimately, here's one really simple way to think about it. The law assumes that you are eligible for overtime pay, right? So any job, the law assumes that you are eligible to be paid overtime. And then there are some jobs that we carve out as being exempt from being eligible for overtime. Does that make sense? So that's what we mean when we say exempt roles. So they're not eligible for overtime. These are tend to be salaried roles, but they're not always. Um, they must be making more than, and this figure changes every year, but as of right now, it's $35,568 annually. So you have to be making over that. If somebody's job pays them less than that on an annual basis, they're automatically non-exempt. Okay. And then there are some classifications that come into play. And this really has to do with the job description. So if it's an executive role, administrative, professional, outside sales, and then what they call computer related occupations, this is the law always takes a really long time to actually catch up with what we are doing in the world, but you'll understand. So you can look at, there are actually very specific definitions for each of these. We don't have time to go into them today, but know if you have a job that could potentially fit into one of these, it could be potentially classified as exempt. And then there's also the highly compensated employees. So anybody who makes over $107,000 annually can also be exempt. Okay, and then non-exempt roles. So we tend to think of these as hourly, but again, it's not always. Eligible for overtime pay. They must be paid at least minimum wage. And these jobs could be hourly, salary, or commission-based jobs. Okay, so Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, you can use that. So first and foremost, we start with the job description, right? So how have we described this job? What are the responsibilities? What's the scope of the job? What's the span of control, right? And then think of it as kind of a 4-box. And what we're talking about here are employees. We'll get to contractors in a moment, but we are talking about employees. So exempt, you can have exempt salaried roles. You can also have exempt hourly roles. It's a little less common, but it is possible. We can have non-exempt salary roles. Again, a little less common, but it does happen. And non-exempt hourly. So what I would say is very likely what you will have is potentially an exempt salaried and non-exempt hourly. And then again, there are rare occurrences where we see the other two boxes. Okay, so that's employees, how we're classifying employees. Let's talk about freelancers versus employees. So freelancers, this is also contractors. People will say contractors when they're saying freelancers. They might also call them 1099s. 1099 is referring to the IRS form that is filed. Okay, so freelancer, contractor, 1099, for the most part, they all mean the same thing. And for the purpose of this webinar, it all means the same thing, okay? All right, so what happens here is businesses do not pay taxes on the freelancer's behalf like they do with an employee. Typically, they're providing a service for a limited period of time. So if somebody is in a freelancer or contract role for an extended period of time, and especially for an indefinite period of time, the Department of Labor would take a look at that and say, if this person has been in this role for multiple years, and again, it's for an undefined period of time, that person's probably more of an employee. Okay, so they provide a service, tends to be for a limited period of time. They also tend to work for multiple clients. So it is possible to have a freelancer who only works for one client, but in general, freelancers would probably work with multiple clients, and that's how they get their income. When and where, this is really important, when and where the work gets done is controlled by the freelancer. So what that means is if you have somebody who you say, I need you to show up to this location from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. every day, and you will be answering calls from our clients. You are controlling when and where the work is done. That is very likely an employee rather than a freelancer. So the flip side of that, a freelancer would be, hey, we have this project and I'm hiring a copywriter. I'm hiring a very specific skill set and it's for the duration of this particular project. And hey, copywriter, here's the work that we need to have. And then you're going to go off and do it. I may be able to say, hey, it's due on this date, right? That's a little bit different. But between now and the due date, the freelancer controls when and where they're doing the work. Okay, so hopefully that distinction makes sense. But that one is really key, especially if the Department of Labor is looking at it. That one's a really, really key distinction between freelancer and employee. They also use their own equipment and they do their own training. So for example, you would not provide a computer for a freelancer. They're going to do their own equipment. They're going to have their own, and you would rely on that. Sometimes, again, you can get around that if you have, like there's an exception if you have specific software, for example, that only your company uses that they would need to use. That's a little bit different from them providing their own equipment. So again, these are all the distinctions that we look at for freelancers. So let's talk about how that then we compare that to employees. So you heard me use the term W-2 earlier. What this means is somebody who, this refers to the IRS form that is used, and it means that somebody is an employee of your organization. So here's what this means. Anyone who performs a service where the employer controls both what is done and how the duties are performed. And one other component of this that tends to come into play is how much is the employer providing coaching on how that actual work is being done. And if there's a significant amount of coaching about how the work needs to be done, then that's an employee, not a contractor. The employer maintains financial control over how the duties are performed. So again, that may be your wages. It might be in the form of performance bonuses, that type of thing. But the employer can maintain financial control. Employees are eligible for benefits, whereas freelancers or contractors are not. Their work performed is a key aspect of the business. And so here's why, this is where I'm going to get a little bit HR nerdy. But this is why you heard lots of discussion about Uber and Lyft and other companies like that, about whether their employees were actually employees or contractors. They started with them as contractors, but because their work was being performed and it's a key aspect of their business, they really should be employees. And that's why the state of California, and I think we'll see that changing in the rest of the country. But that's why is this really important distinction of employee versus contractor. And here's one that a lot of people don't think about, but I think is one of the most important, is really employees are covered by federal discrimination and harassment laws. Now, there are some states that also cover contractors under discrimination and harassment laws, but on the federal level, contractors are not covered. So that's something to consider and something really to think about as well. All right. How are we doing so far? It's a lot, I know.
Doing
Let's
great.
talk about compliance. Okay, awesome. So let's talk about compliance. When you're a solopreneur, understanding your local labor laws is really important. So I'm going to share with you a few resources that you can just, again, this is DIY HR, right? So here are some of the resources that you can do. First and foremost, Google. Google will find you all kinds of information. So if you search your state or city, now some cities also have specific labor laws. So that's why it's important to search for both. But search your state and your city where you're operating, plus the term labor laws, and you'll get tons of resources and tons of information. The next resource you can use is SHRM. It's a terrible acronym, I know, but the Society for HR Management. Now, they're great for compliance stuff. Not so great for strategic HR. That's, again, a whole other webinar, but they're really great for compliance stuff. So you can search our local chapters, very likely in your area. And then their national website, it also has a ton of compliance information, so you can search there. And then any professional organization that you are a part of for your industry. So for example, I work with the Washington Hospitality Association. They have a lot of really great information about local labor laws and can help you stay on top of what's happening in your local area and in your specific industry. So they're a great they're a great source for information as well. And then you can also consider hiring fractional HR. And so you can hire somebody on to keep track of all of that stuff for you. So um, let's look then at the last part, which is building your culture. And like I said before, the answer is yes, you absolutely have a culture, even if it's just you. So there are some policies. People will say to me like, I don't want to have policies in place. I don't want this to feel bureaucratic. And I am not here to make your company feel bureaucratic. I promise you that. But there are some policies that I do think are really important for you to have in place, even as a solopreneur. Even if you don't have any employees, there are a couple of really, really foundational policies. So let's dive in. Before we do that, this is one of the most important things, and I would recommend, again, if you have something in front of you, write this down. Your company culture, again, regardless of how many people are employed, your company culture is defined by the worst behavior you're willing to tolerate. That's it. It will be defined by exactly that. It'll be the worst behavior you're willing to tolerate. So with that in mind, these are the policies that I recommend having in place. First is a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement. Your commitment to diversity, your commitment to inclusion and equity. What are the reporting mechanisms if people see actions or policies that are outside of that? But you really should start with a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion for your organization. A code of conduct. And again, even if you don't have employees, I do think this is really important because you do have clients, you have customers or vendors, you have other companies or business partners that you work with. You should establish a code of conduct. What do you expect? And it really is, sometimes I call this, when I'm working with companies, standards of behavior as well. But it's essentially are you willing to tolerate and what are you not? And so it will cover things like, we don't allow retaliation, we don't allow harassment, and you can define all of those. But having a stated code of conduct in place is really, really important to protect both you, your employees if you have them, but even if you don't, to also protect others that you're engaging with on a regular basis. And it states really clearly, this is what I'm willing to tolerate and this is what I'm not. And along with that is also an anti-harassment policy. So again, being very, very clear about your expectations when it comes to not tolerating harassment within your workplace, within your company culture. And then depending on your type of business, you may need to also have COVID-19 protocols in place. This is obviously something we've added over the past couple of years. But this is one that a lot of companies they're not spending enough time really thinking through what are our guidelines, what are our recommendations? Do we have a recommendation or a requirement for our team? Do we have, when it comes to vaccination, for example, if somebody tests positive for COVID-19, what's the protocol? Are you allowing time off? Will you pay for that time off? There's lots of things that would be important to define. And again, think about it from the aspect of clients you might interact with, customers you might interact with, vendors, etc. So these are the four that I would say, even for solopreneurs, they're really critically important to have in place. All right, I did it. I got through all the information. I'll open it up and see if there are any questions on anything that I covered or anything else that might have come up for you as we were talking.
Yes, if you have any questions for Rebecca, you can pop them into the chat now, and I will sort of moderate them. But That was so helpful as someone who has 2 freelancers on my team, knowing how to differentiate those things and what really makes them a freelancer, versus a contractor and so on. I actually didn't know that myself, so that was super helpful, as we're looking to
Yeah.
hire full-time
A
people in the
lot of
future.
a lot of people don't. Yeah, a lot of business owners don't. And I think it's really important to know the difference because it then will also help guide you in how you treat freelancers versus employees as well. So I've worked with a lot of companies where they'll say, for example, oh, we treat everybody on the team, and you might have a mix of employees and contractors on your team. So think of like an agency, for example, where like a digital marketing agency where you have both employees and contractors who might be there for a specific project. And I would have leaders who would say, oh, we just treat everybody exactly the same. And it's a really, really well intentioned. You know, the intention behind that is, oh, we want everybody to feel a part of the team. We don't want anybody to feel like a second class citizen. And yes, all of that I am all for. But it means that we cannot, for example, you don't furnish a computer to your contractors. They don't have access to benefits. Sometimes they don't even necessarily attend team meetings. Right. So, like, there are lots of things where you really need to, even when the intentions are really good, it's important to know the difference between the two so that you can act accordingly. Because some of those things, you know, again, if this is all about, you know, will the Department of Labor come knocking at your door? These are the things that they would look at to determine ultimately what they're trying to prevent is exploitation and calling people contractors when they really should be employees. Because as an employee, they have access to benefits, they have access to overtime, right? Like their job being classified as eligible for overtime. Like this is ultimately the reason that all of these things are in place. So even with good intentions, sometimes we can sort of step over in the wrong area and do things that actually aren't super helpful for your organization long term.
Yep, and I've seen that firsthand, so I know that that is
Yep.
absolutely the case. As Nathalie said, this is gold. I don't see any questions coming in, but I do want to make sure, Rebecca, that people know how to stay in contact with you, and how to contact you after this. One quick question before we jump into that is, how much of your business revenue should you put into your workforce, especially during those early stages? How do you manage to let someone go when you feel guilty to let them go? Those are 2 great questions.
Yeah. Okay. So let's take the first one. How much of your revenue? I would say there's not necessarily a magic number or magic percentage, but as you are doing the calculations and figuring out, can I afford to hire this person? Usually we use somewhere between 30 and 40% of the salary as an additional for taxes, benefits, all of that. So that's a fairly safe number. I tend to like 35 to 40% because it gives you a little bit of wiggle room. But that's the figure I would use as you're calculating and estimating on an annual basis. How much will it cost you to employ this person? That's a pretty good number. And then, you know, the other question I get a lot is about how do I figure out what this job is worth? Um, or how much I should be paying this person. Um, and so there are lots of resources I have with that too. You can send me an email. I could send you some specifics depending on your industry. But we tend to find salary.com is a good one. Um, I don't tend to use Glassdoor, and a lot of HR will not necessarily use Glassdoor for that because it's all just self reported. But salary.com, payscale.com is another one that's really good for determining. And then there are a lot of salary or pay bands depending on your industry. So again, I'll go back to digital marketing. Robert Half releases a report every year, which is pay bands for digital marketing agency roles. And then it gives you a calculation based on where you are in the country. So there are resources like that that might exist. Again, go back to those professional organizations that you're a part of locally as well. And they can give you some indications about where a good starting place would be. And then just search for job postings too. Search for what's out there. What are your, competitors paying people? And obviously that will give you a really good insight as well. And then what was the second question?
The second one was, how do you manage to let someone go when you feel guilty?
Oh, it's hard. Here's what I would say. I will go back to what Brene Brown says, which is being clear is kind. Letting somebody continue on the team who is struggling with their performance or is not the right fit. You feel guilty about it. The longer you let it go, the worse the problem will get, and I can guarantee you that. So being really clear, first of all, I would say, have you done all that you can in helping to coach that person to do the job correctly, to do it the way that you need it to be done? Have you done all the coaching? And then if the answer is yes, then and you've given them an adequate amount of time to actually make some changes, then you need to be clear, and that is the kindest thing to do. The worst thing that you can do is just let it go, or if you have other members on the team, if you don't deal with problem performance, that causes an issue for your top performers as well. So make sure that you keep that in mind as well. And I have found, like, again, the best thing to do is just to be clear. You can do it in a way that is compassionate to that person. You can help support them as they find their next job. But you do need to be clear.
I love that. Being clear is kind. And that's a great note to end on. Rebecca, for those of you watching live or the replay, make sure to take a screenshot of this last page here. You'll definitely want to keep in contact with Rebecca. And if for some reason you forget to take a screenshot, then don't forget Rebecca is a member of the 10th house, so you can always direct message her
Right.
in there. She's posted a couple of times of many great resources. So you can also just search her name in the search bar, and you'll see the different tools and links that she's been so kind to share within the community. But thank you again, Rebecca, for joining us today. This was truly extremely helpful.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
We'll talk to you soon. Bye, everyone.